Our speaker this afternoon is David Blight. He is professor of history at Yale University. He's among the foremost authorities on the Civil War and its legacy. He has widely published and has been widely recognized with prizes and awards for his work. You will get a full appreciation of his accomplishments this evening at 8 o'clock when in the University Center ballroom he will be talking about Slaves No More, two recently discovered slave narratives, and the story of emancipation. His topic this afternoon is the Civil War and Emancipation in American history, in American memory. So please join me in welcoming Professor Blight.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to the University of Montana. This is a somewhat less formal situation than presumably we will have tonight, but I will speak for a half hour or so just to lay out some of the issues and problems in how we Americans have, over time, processed the meaning and memory of our most, arguably at least, our most conflicted, difficult, vexing historical memory. But what do we mean when we talk about memory? I have realized over the last several years, as I've lectured countless times about this problem, that it often needs some definition. It certainly does for historians. Some historians think that by studying the problem of collective memory, as one good friend of mine and a good historian once said, that I've gone over to the enemy. And I think what he meant by that is, of course, postmodernism, the idea that no truth matters, all interpretations are just interpretations, memory is just ideology, memory is merely one culture against another culture, and so forth and so on. I don't believe that at all. The study of memory, collective memory, is no different, for historians at least, than the study of any other subject. We still do research, lots of it, I hope, and in the end, we are in effect writing histories of memory. But what do we mean by collective memory? You can still get up a fight, quite a row in interdisciplinary discussions about whether there even is such a thing as collective memory. There are those, particularly among social scientists, sociologists in particular, who don't accept the idea that there even is a thing called collective memory. We all understand memory on the individual biological level. That's easy. It's not easy to understand exactly how it works, of course, and there's an entire industry out there with multi-million-dollar grants studying the biology and the neuroscience of memory. As we speak, people are right now, this afternoon, still trying to locate memory in our brains. And I've been to interdisciplinary conferences, wonderful conferences, where I'm usually one of the one or two token historians among the cognitive scientists who study memory, which is fascinating for me, because usually at those I can get away with saying almost anything because nobody's a historian. But we understand memory as an individual phenomenon pretty well, at least instinctively we do. As individuals, we can't function without it. We don't know how to go find our car after this without our memory. We can't even find self-awareness. We don't know who we are. We don't have an identity in some ways without our memory. We don't know where we're from without our memory. In practical ways and in beyond practical ways, we can understand memory on this individual level. It is, in effect, a great deal of what makes us human. As soon as we talk about a collective memory, it gets muddy, it gets unsystematic, it gets messy, doesn't it? How do you know a collective memory when you meet one? How does a collective memory form? Do groups remember in ways at least similar to individuals remember? Can there be a group memory that itself has a biological component to it? Do nations remember? Do institutions remember? I think they do. I think we tend to know those collective memories when we meet them or when we see them. The Israeli philosopher Avishai Marjalit, in a wonderful little book, it's called The Ethics of Memory. It's really an essay. In Ethics of Memory, Marjalit says, memory is knowledge from the past. It is not necessarily knowledge about the past. Now, in everyday life and in the world of scholarship, all considerations of memory, it seems to me, are like riding on a teeter-totter of trust and distrust. It's trust and distrust on a teeter-totter. We don't know whether to trust memory, and usually we don't. Do you really trust your personal memory? Well, to a certain degree you do, because you have to. Do you trust other people's memory? Do we as scholars trust memory over the recorded source? Do we trust memory in oral history, even when we have aggregates of it, even when we have 100 interviews? Do we trust memory? We tend not to, and yet we don't know what to do without it. How many times have you heard people say, oh, be careful with that oral history material? And then you realize the same person who may have said, be careful with that, quoted it 6 or 7 times. We used to be deeply distrustful of the Works Progress Administration, 3,300 odd oral narratives, oral testimonies from ex-slaves. The great WPA narratives done in the 1930s. Volumes and volumes of them, generally with people in their 80s and some in their 90s. There was a time when historians were taught not to use those sources. They just weren't trustworthy. How could you trust a bunch of 89-year-olds remembering their childhoods in slavery? And then a lot of things changed about our assumptions. A lot of things changed about, in some ways, the politics of the subject. A lot of things changed about what was the subject. A lot of things changed about doing the history of people who hadn't had a history. And pretty soon we began to realize, well, maybe those WPA narratives were going to lead us somewhere, especially in aggregates, especially when we found a dozen or 2 dozen or 10 dozen expressions that were similar about a master-slave relationship, or about how they grew up remembering the surrender, as it was so many times called. What the surrender meant when that phrase was used, that word was used in a WPA narrative, it did often literally mean Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox, but the surrender meant the war. It meant the end of the Civil War. Well, after the surrender, people would say. That might mean something they're recollecting in 1890. It might mean something they were recollecting in 1870. It might have meant the recollection of a process. At any rate, we came to have some sense of trust, I guess. But you know, the reflection on memory is almost as old as philosophy itself. My favorite piece of writing on memory is from the 4th century AD. It's from Augustine's Confessions. And there's great reflection and writing and meditation on memory well before Augustine. But in Augustine's Confessions, if you know that text at all, it contains about a 40-page section where Augustine really just reflects deeply on the nature of memory and what it actually is and how it functions. And he's especially concerned to try to figure that out because Augustine knows that God knows his memory, and he's worried about that. God knows what he's done. Anyway, there are many passages in Augustine. He calls memory the vast court. He calls it the treasury of our minds. And he stands in awe of what he calls this great chamber. And then he says, quote, "No one has sounded the bottom thereof." Great is the power of memory, Augustine wrote. Great is the power of memory, he wrote, a fearful thing, and oh my God, a deep and boundless manifoldness This thing is the mind, and this am I myself. It's almost as though Augustine is telling us, frankly, quite directly, we are our memories. They are what makes us human. They dictate to us in some ways. We respond to them, and then we endlessly revise them. We receive our memories in a sense, and then we start remaking them every day. Memory can control us, it can overwhelm us, it can even poison us. We can have way too much of it, and we can be rendered almost actionless, immobile. Or memory sometimes can free us. Knowing something, learning something, can sometimes liberate us. The problem is memory is often, especially the collective, individual kind, for sure. This is what all this trauma study is about. But memory in the collective sense, learning a new part of our story, learning a new part of our history, learning a new difficult part of our history, facing down a past we wish we hadn't had to know. It can sometimes be the thing we can't live with, but we also can't live without. That's what makes it so interesting. It's what makes it also kind of troubling. Now, as I was just saying at the outset, what historians have done with this is we've simply learned how to study the history of memory. We've had to learn how, and it doesn't mean we've figured out exactly how to do it, and doesn't mean that we're always coming up with accurate interpretations of historical memory. All interpretations lead to new interpretations, but we've had to study the process by which groups actually remember. Groups remember by ritual. Groups remember by rhetoric and narrative. Groups remember in their politics, in the kinds of political discourse they develop, the kinds of political rhetoric they use on one another. What is one election about but the last one? What are elections about but the narratives we tell ourselves we're living in? Everybody says every election is about the future, but every election is fought about things that have happened in the past. Which memory do you want to draw on? You want to draw on the New Deal's deep legacies, or do you want to draw on the argument against the New Deal's great legacies? What is the fight about this legacy of the New Deal but a fight over America's national historical memory? Are we the nation the New Deal created or not? Are we the nation that lives under the umbrella of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, or are we not? That was at the heart of our elections and our political culture, from the passage of the 14th Amendment to the passage of the '64 Civil Rights Act. Were we the nation of the 14th Amendment, or were we not? Now, collective memory is unsystematic. I'm going to grant you that. But I always go back to a few philosophers and writers when I get trouble to understand something, and I sort of lean on them. We probably all do that. Emerson once said we sort of take our books off our shelves and lean on them when we need them. And Emerson is one I lean on. Emerson wrote about everything, and sure enough, he wrote a wonderful little essay on memory. Basically, it was Emerson asking, so what is this thing called memory? And in it he has a nugget. He says, memory is as an affection. We remember the things which we love and those which we hate. We tend to remember, Emerson seems to have been saying, the things we love and the things we hate. Or, put another way, we remember at the extremes. It's not always the case. But think about that. What gets riveted in our memories? A love experience, a first love, maybe the second, or parental love, or love of a child, the kind of love that endures, or experiences around that love. It might even be love outside of family. It might be love of place. It might even be love of country. But then the other extreme, the things we hate. I will never forget the time your people did such and such to my people. Americans were astonished during the Balkan Wars of the 90s These crazy Serbs and Kosovars were remembering some god-awful battle in the 8th century in Kosovo, which none of us had ever learned anything about, of course. And we wondered, why can't these people forget anything? Get over it, we would say. And well, it turns out we haven't always gotten over everything either. And then there's William Faulkner, who in this one line that he puts in the mouth of one of his characters in the novel The Hamlet, one of the Snopeses, I forget which. But in one of the Snopeses, at one point in The Hamlet, Faulkner has him say, I quote, "Only thank God have," sorry, start that one over. "Only thank God men have done learned how to forget quick what they ain't brave enough to try to cure." Can't cure that problem, can't solve that problem, can't deal with that problem, forget it. Put it away. Rub it out. That sentence from Faulkner, like some others, is in some ways a perfect statement of what happened to the memory of the Civil War in the United States. Thank God men have learned how to forget quick what they ain't brave enough to cure. And then there's Mark Twain, who warned us about relying on memory at all. It was Twain who said, "When I was a young man, I remembered everything, whether it happened or not. But," said Twain, "now that I'm an old man, I remember only the things that never happened." Older we get, we make it up. How many times have you told that great story from your youth? That best story you've got from college days? That best achievement of something? And man, the more times you tell it, you sometimes at the end of telling it wonder, God, is any of that true? You don't even know anymore. Well, I could go on and on. I've actually been, in recent months, the past year or more, reading more and more memoir. I read hundreds of memoirs for the book on Civil War memory, but I've been actually reading more and more war memoirs of the 20th century. And one of the greatest I've ever read is the very recent memoir by Günter Grass called Peeling the Onion. If you haven't read that one, he's a very controversial figure, of course, because it's in that memoir where he confesses for the first time openly of being in the Hitler Youth and of joining the Waffen-SS when he was 18 in his northern German town and going off to war in literally the last months of World War II. But he has some reflections on just what memory really is and means in that book that are, I think, eternal, timeless, especially when we think about what he's remembering. But now let me shift for a few moments, to this question of the Civil War in American memory and just lay out a little bit of what this earlier book of mine attempted to do and see where you're at on this question, and then we can open up to discussion. Primo Levi, the Holocaust survivor, wrote an essay in 1986. Later he committed suicide, of course, but Levi, Auschwitz survivor, never could stop writing about memory. He wrote a little essay in '86 called The Memory of Offense. The memory of being offended. And in it, he says this, I quote him, and he's reflecting on what can happen to how some memories can be taken once they're out of your control by other people, and they can really be brutalized. They can be just deformed. They can be mutilated. It was once your memory, you thought, until it's out there. He says, I quote, "The end point of the deformation of the memory of a committed fault is its complete suppression. Now," he says though, "such suppressions of memory and the responsibility for them can result," he said, quote, "from a deliberate intent to lie." Somebody may want to really change your memory out of a deliberate attempt to just reverse it. and convert what you think is your truth into an utter lie. He said that can be a deliberate intent to lie. But he says, in most cases, I'm quoting him now, we're not faced with a deliberate intent to lie. We are faced, he says, with, quote, a fossilized lie, an ancient lie, frozen into formula. An ancient lie, frozen into formula, repeated so many times, over and over and over, that it just becomes what is. In some ways, that's what happened to the memory of the American Civil War. The idea that it really wasn't about slavery, it had to be about something else in a society and a nation of progress. I was doing research. I actually wasn't there to do research at the time. I was there to give a lecture, but I was at the Huntington Library a few years ago. And I was there for about 2 days to give something called the Allen Nevins Lecture. And Allen Nevins was a great Civil War historian, and his papers are all there. And so for a day and a half or so, I thought I'd just kind of crawl around in Allen Nevins' papers. Nevins was a great historian of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s. He wrote this 8-volume sort of epic history of the entire Civil War era that I had grown up reading. And I'm just thumbing around through Nevins' papers, and I bumped into a little essay by one of my heroes, not Nevins in this case, but Bruce Catton. Now, I don't know if any of you grew up Civil War enthusiasts or readers as I did, but Bruce Catton had a lot to do with me being interested in this field. As a teenager, I started reading Bruce Catton's narrative histories. He was the great popular historian of the Civil War in the 1950s and 60s. And I don't remember exactly when I started reading Catton, nor can I even remember which book I read first, but I read all 7, or was it 8, of his books on the Civil War between when I was about 14 and somewhere there in my 20s. It was all Catton's fault, and I loved Catton. He was just such a beautiful, he didn't do a PhD in history, he was never abused with academia, he was a journalist. He was a World War II correspondent. He wrote beautiful narrative, which was of course what drew me in. And book after book entitled A Stillness at Appomattox, Mr. Lincoln's Army, Glory Road, and many others. Anyway, here was this little essay buried in Nevins' papers in manuscript. And the reason it was there is because Nevins and Catton had become deeply involved, in fact, had become the leaders of the U.S. Civil War Centennial Commission by 1963, 64, and 65, and some of their papers got kind of mingled together. There's this essay there, I bump into it in manuscript form. I later realized it had been published. It was a little essay called The End of the Centennial 1965, and 1965 was in the title. Note the date, 1965 is when he's writing it. And here's my hero, Bruce Catton. I had just published this book on Civil War memory, and I thought, oh, this is how cool. I'm bound to find something here I can use in the lecture. And there was Catton discussing memory. He actually used the word memory explicitly, and that reassured me. He marveled in this little essay at how Americans, he said, had healed, his word, from their Civil War, and that any nation could actually commemorate so openly such a bloody Civil War was quite a triumph. The war was a source, said Catton in this essay, of unity, his word. And I quote him, "The memory of our Civil War has not been a divisive force in this country." And when I read that, I had one of those moments where I thought, oh, Bruce, say it ain't so. You didn't write that. It reminded me of the time I ran into Al Kaline, my childhood baseball hero. I grew up in Detroit. Kaline was God. At the end of his career, I'm about 29, and I run into him in the Detroit airport, and I suddenly became a 12-year-old. I walked up to him, "Mr. Kaline, could I have your autograph, sir, please, may I?" And he was smoking. And it just ruined it for me. Al wasn't supposed to smoke. You know, it was like my hero should always be what I thought he was. Just number 6, you know. So here was Bruce Catton saying exactly the opposite of what I had just argued in this 500-page book. And I wanted to weep. Now I read on, for forging all this unity, Catton gave credit, he said, to Grant and Lee and the nature of the surrender at Appomattox. But primarily Catton gave credit, and this was the hardest part for me. He said, all that unity from the Civil War in our culture, remember when he's writing this, 1965. Primarily he gave credit to what he called the Confederate legend, which he described as, quote, a mighty omnipresent force in the land. In all seriousness, writes Catton, quote, the legend of the lost cause has been an asset to the entire country. Now, I could hardly take it. I had 2 chapters in this book arguing exactly the opposite. Now, Catton's portrayal of the lost cause here in this little essay was that of a benign, innocent, kind of romantic cluster of legends driven by the assumption, he said, his words, that no hint of enmity should ever be kept alive, unquote, from the Civil War. Now I was wondering, where in the world did he get this from? His lost cause was the story of a noble sacrifice and heroism on the part of the South, of a nostalgia for an older civilization that perhaps had been a kind of bulwark against modernism, and that in the end, as Catton himself put it, it saved us. The lost cause, the Confederate legend, had saved us? Now at the very end of the essay, as though Bruce was trying to redeem himself, he acknowledged that in 1965, the year of the Voting Rights Act, the year after the '64 Civil Rights Act, he said the war had left what he called the unfinished business of black equality as its deepest legacy, and that, Catton's words, the Negro was what the war was about, somehow. Somehow. Now that somehow might have been a riff on Abraham Lincoln's use of the word somehow in the 3rd paragraph of the 2nd inaugural. If you know Lincoln's 2nd inaugural, there's that moment where Lincoln says, all knew. He's reflecting back to 1861 when he took his 1st inaugural. He says, somehow all knew the war was about slavery, somehow. Now, the point of telling you this Bruce Catton story is simply this. I could hardly forgive my hero until I sat down and reflected on it for a while. And I realized Bruce was writing that in 1965. The conventional wisdom, the mainstream view or understanding of the Confederate lost cause and the Confederate legend's impact on American culture by 1965 is essentially the way Bruce Catton portrayed it. It had unified us. It had helped us make Robert E. Lee a national hero along with Abraham Lincoln. It had helped us admire the Confederate soldier along with the Union soldier. It had enabled us to spread all the valor and the glory around in that war. It had enabled us to spread the responsibility around in that war to the extent there was no responsibility. And in an ironic sense, though I think Catton believed what he was writing, he was actually capturing the mainstream view at that moment in time. There hadn't been serious books done on the lost cause yet. That was all yet to come. There are now several of them. And Bruce Catton didn't understand or couldn't understand yet that the lost cause was also a virulent racial ideology, deeply rooted in white supremacy. Robert Penn Warren, the great Southern poet, novelist, writer, who ended up a kind of self-willed expatriate in the North, lived much of the second half of his life actually in Connecticut, and taught at Yale, or at least occasionally taught at Yale, once wrote, his words, somewhere in their bones, said Penn Warren, Americans have a storehouse of lessons drawn from their Civil War. Now, exactly what those lessons are supposed to be and who gets to determine them is, I think, the most vexing question in our historical memory. Among all those possible lessons, wrote Penn Warren, is the realization, as he put it, quote, that slavery looms up mountainously in the story and cannot be talked away. But then Warren acknowledges a lesson of equal importance when he says, when one is happy in forgetfulness, sometimes facts just get forgotten. And that is in some ways what we did with our Civil War as a means of making it a unified experience, Bruce Catton's unified experience, a palatable experience. Or as William Dean Howells put it in a lovely line in 1900, what the American public always likes, said Howells, is a tragedy as long as it has a happy ending. All right, when I did this book on Civil War memory, I did what most of us historians do. I boiled down what felt like infinite information. I was trying to cover the 50-year period, the half-century period after the war. I decided to stop at that 50th anniversary just to control the subject, although I am now going to try to write a shorter book that deals with the period from the 1930s up at least through the centennial. At any rate, I did what all of us do. I boiled all that possible information down about Southerners, Northerners, whites, and blacks into three kinds of memory. Always choose a trinity if you have a choice. The first kind of memory I called reconciliationist memory, which took root in the process. It took root very early, during the war, in fact. It took root in the process, especially of dealing with the dead in totally unprecedented scope, from battlefields, prisons, and hospitals, and then developed in many ways this reconciliationist memory much earlier than the embittered history of Reconstruction has sometimes allowed us to believe. The second kind of memory I called white supremacist memory, which took many forms very early after the war, including terror and violence. And then it locked arms with reconciliationist and reunionist in the culture of all kinds, and eventually delivered the United States a racially segregated memory of its Civil War on Southern terms by as early as 1900, and certainly by the time of the 50th anniversaries of the Civil War around 1911 to 1915. And the third kind of memory I called emancipationist memory. I couldn't come up with a better term than that. It doesn't always roll off your tongue perfectly, but it at least rolled. Emancipationist memory was embodied in African Americans' own complex remembrance of their own freedom, and there was no single black memory of slavery, the Civil War, emancipation, and Reconstruction. In the book Race and Reunion, I actually divide black memory into 5 different kinds of categories that I'll spare you for the moment. But emancipationist memory of the Civil War was also rooted in the politics of radical Reconstruction after the war. It was also rooted in conceptions of the Civil War, which was in part Lincoln's own conception, as the death of a first American republic and the birth or rebirth of a second American republic, built around this expanded idea of freedom and built around the 3 great Civil War constitutional amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. The problem, though, with the memory of our Civil War, first in that 50-year period, and I think it still is there in our culture whenever we face it, is that Americans have had to take that experience, 620,000 dead, slightly over 1 million wounded, a destruction of that 80-some-year-old original republic and the reinvention of a new one, rooted in this fledgling, unstable idea of racial equality. And they've had to figure it out through the tangled relationship of two profound ideas that sometimes just cannot be mixed in balance. One idea is healing, and the other idea is justice. And if you think about it, all over the world today, in all those 20-some-odd nations and societies that have had truth commissions of one kind and another, and there are over 20 of them. South Africa is the one we know the most about. It's the most famous one. But truth commissions of one kind and another have existed in Guatemala and Chile and many other places. India has had a truth commission of a kind. Wherever nations have had to try to face some piece of their past that is truly unreconciled, they're trying to balance healing and justice. Who gets healed, with what justice, and who decides? Now, one way to go at all of this, of course, is just not look back at all. Just don't do the past. Just forget it. Can't cure it? Forget it. Don't go there. But you know, especially after the 20th century, especially after the bloodiest, most violent century in human history, 280 million people died in war in the 20th century alone. Just do the math, add that up by year, and by God, in this first 7 years of this century, we're not doing a lot better. After the 20th century, this option of just don't look back at all. And especially after the Holocaust, which is subject number one in the world's attempt to try to figure out how to face pasts, that's no longer an option. So finding some balance between healing and justice is everybody's problem. We had to do it first with our Civil War, and we never had any truth commissions. The closest we ever had to anything resembling a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it really wasn't invented for that, was what were called the Ku Klux Klan hearings of 1870 and 71, which produced some 14 volumes, huge thick volumes of testimony. These were the hearings done in 7 southern states by tribunals of 3 congressmen sent into those 7 states to investigate the actions of the Ku Klux Klan. They interviewed literally thousands of witnesses. They interviewed perpetrators of the violence and many, many, many victims of the violence. And those books of testimony are an extraordinary record of what actually happened. Even if only 60% of it is relatively true, it's an extraordinary collection of the ways in which terror and intimidation and murder and rape were used as a part of real politics in America. And part of the purpose of those were, of course, to determine adjudication, to decide who would be indicted and who might be tried and so forth. It really wasn't in any sense a modern 20th century or 21st century idea of a truth commission necessarily, but it's the closest thing we ever had. Now, why or how did American Civil War memory eventually find itself caught, willingly, generally, not always willingly, after much struggle, much debate, much conflict, fought over in the form of memoir, fought over in the form of political rhetoric, fought over in the form of monument building, fought over in the form of history writing and textbook writing, and all the other ways that we struggle over versions of the past? How did it end up in a kind of a cul-de-sac of a national reunion where the story of emancipation, the story of slavery as a cause, emancipation as a principal, if not the principal result, was either erased or lost? That happened a lot of ways, but one of the ways it happened is that in the end, consciously or not, American culture, generally, not everybody, and there of course were critics and dissenters on this, but by and large, American culture decided that in the end, we had a civil war and nobody was responsible. And you can find it in 1,000 examples. Let me just use two. One comes from a piece of fiction, and one comes from a speech. There was a popular novel written in 1912 called Cease Firing. Written by a Southern woman writer, Mary Johnston. Very interesting writer. She's not well known today, but she's interesting. She wrote a trilogy of war novels. Her most famous was the novel called To Have and to Hold, which was a big bestseller just before Cease Firing. And all these three novels came out at the time of the 50th anniversary of the Civil War. She is sometimes credited as being the first woman to write war fiction. I mean, combat novels, so to speak. I don't know if she's really first on that or not. I leave that to somebody else to debate. But at the end of her novel, Cease Firing, the novel is ending with Lee's army retreating from Petersburg west to the surrender at Appomattox. It's the end of the war. And she has this, it's literally in the last few pages of the book, and she has this dialogue between two Confederate veterans as they are marching toward surrender. One Confederate soldier asks the other what he thinks it's all about. And the other guy answers, quote, "Well, I think that we were both right and both wrong, and that in the beginning, each side might have been more patient and much wiser. Life and history and right and wrong and minds of men look out of more windows than we used to think. Did you never hear of the shield that had two sides and both were made of precious metal?" Well, everybody was right. Nobody was wrong. And now Mary Johnston, she's an astute writer. She's actually capturing there a sentiment. By 1912, this is the 50th anniversary of the Civil War, by 1912, she's capturing a sentiment there that was all over American culture. Honor the veteran. Stop talking about the cause. Honor the soldier. Support the troops. But don't talk about how we got there, what the results were. Don't ask why. Just ask what. That's really what had been happening to American memory culture about the Civil War now for decades. And any of you who have ever been east of the Mississippi, which I suspect most of you have, know that every town in the South and every town in the North and some towns west of the Mississippi, including Denver, have Civil War monuments. I've seen villages in Vermont that don't have traffic lights. You can't even find an open store. But they have a Civil War monument to the 14 guys who died off farms around that village. The problem was that outside of all that pathos around what she was saying, or what she has those two Confederate veterans saying to one another, outside all of that pathos, all that endearing mutuality of sacrifice among soldiers, there was another process at work. The denigration and dehumanization of African American dignity and the attempted erasure of slave emancipation from the national narrative of what the Civil War had ever been about. That process of the development of Jim Crow America, and I don't mean just Jim Crow on statute books, Jim Crow in the national psyche, Jim Crow in the national mind, Jim Crow in the culture. That other process led the black editor scholar W.B. Du Bois to conclude that same year, 1912, in an editorial in the Crisis magazine, the magazine of the NAACP, when Du Bois said, I quote, "This country has had its appetite for facts on history and the Negro problem spoiled by sweets." One other little example in the more popular realm of this everybody was right, nobody was wrong idea. Blue-gray reunions became a huge phenomenon by the 1890s. If you ever read Race and Reunion, I talk about them at length. There were early efforts to have these blue-gray reunions, Northern and Southern veterans, as early as the 1870s. They didn't work very well at first. Confederates in particular weren't too keen on coming to blue-gray reunions, thank you very much, especially to places like Gettysburg. They were always trying to get them to come to Gettysburg on the anniversary of the battle, which was the worst place most Confederates wanted to go. It was the site of their worst defeat. But by the mid-80s, 20th anniversary of the war, 25th anniversary of the Civil War, and into the 1890s, blue-gray reunions became cultural phenomena. Cities all over the country would compete like the dickens for them. Well, for one thing, they brought in millions of dollars into cities, and finally southern cities started to host them. Louisville, eventually Atlanta. The great blue-gray reunion of 1900 was in Atlanta. Attracted thousands and thousands of veterans from both sides. This was still the heyday of Civil War veteran culture. They weren't beginning to die off in huge numbers yet, but they will soon demographically begin to fade. At any rate, at that Atlanta blue-gray reunion, there was a heated exchange in the two keynote addresses by the two leaders of the two organizations. The leader of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, was a man named Shaw, from no relation to Robert Gould Shaw of the famous 54th Massachusetts. And the leader of the United Confederate Veterans, the UCV, was a former Confederate general named John B. Gordon. Well, when Commander Shaw of the GAR got up to speak, he decided to make his central theme the problem of textbooks. And both sides were doing this. The GAR and the UCV, local posts, national level, they all had textbook committees. They were all trying to shape publishing in textbooks, the story of the war that was being taught to children. And they put a lot of money and a lot of energy into this. There's no mistaking it. And when Shaw got up to speak, he chastised the Southern veterans for trying to control the story too much. He said, among other things, quote, and you can almost see or feel a kind of school-marmish finger waving. He said, quote, keeping alive sectional teachings as to the justice and rights of the cause of the South in the hearts of your children is all out of order. It is unwise and unjust. Confederate veterans sitting there must have thought, yeah, right. So you're going to write the books, but we don't get to write the books. Well, when Gordon got up to answer, this is John B. Gordon, by the way, who was designated by Lee to, in effect, lead the surrender march and the stacking of the rifles at Appomattox. It's the same John B. Gordon who will be elected senator and governor from Georgia during Reconstruction after the redemption by the Democratic Party of Georgia. Gordon was also one of the founders and leaders of the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia, although he lied through his teeth about it in the KKK hearings of 1871. But Gordon, by the 1890s, had become one of the most sought-after Reunion Day, Memorial Day, ex-Confederate speakers because he was really good at it. In his response to Shaw, in part, he said this: when he tells me and my Southern comrades that teaching our children that the cause for which we fought and our comrades died is all wrong, I must earnestly protest. In the name of the future manhood of the South, I protest. What are we to teach them? If we cannot teach them that their fathers were right, then it follows that these Southern children must be taught that they were wrong. I never will be ready to have my children taught that I was ever wrong, or that the cause of my people was unjust and unholy. Oh, my friends, you were right, but we were right too. Everybody was right. Nobody was wrong. There was a big, bloody, horrible war, but there was no reason why it was fought, except valor, glory, soldiering. Now, let me just stop by, there are 1,000 stories I could tell about this, but I was led into the field of historical memory innocently, a little bit stupidly actually. I didn't know what I was doing, which is often the way to do a lot of things, because then you're not aware of some theory you're supposed to be applying or in some trend you're supposed to be participating. You just do it. I started writing about memory in the last chapter of my first book, which was my dissertation on Frederick Douglass, because that's the word he used. The last chapter was about Douglass's attempts to hold on to a kind of abolitionist memory of the Civil War in the last third of his life, when he was losing that public debate and struggle over against the lost cause tradition. And I published that book in 1989, and the next year Ken Burns's great PBS series on the Civil War came out in 1990. And I suspect some of you saw it, or have seen it over and over again as they keep playing it on PBS, because it's been a good cash cow for PBS. And Ken is a great filmmaker. He is artistically and technically a brilliant filmmaker. He also now has become our national historian by somebody's election. And the ending of that film really both inspired me, but it really troubled me. I don't know if you can remember the last episode. But in part 9 of his 11 hours of that series, the last episode goes from about 25 minutes on the Lincoln assassination. I mean, he really takes his time with that. And then you fast forward through Reconstruction. There's a little bit of mention of Reconstruction, a little bit of image of Reconstruction. We hear Ulysses Grant saying something about let us have peace. And then we fast forward to the 1913 50th anniversary blue-gray reunion at Gettysburg, because there's film footage of it. Stunning footage. You can get it on video today, the actual footage, not Ken's film, but the footage. And there they were, these glorious old veterans with their medals hanging on them, shaking hands across the stone walls at Gettysburg in July 1868 and 1913. And we hear Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, still alive, the hero of Little Round Top, about whom we've heard a lot earlier in the film, and about whom many people have read because they've read the novel Killer Angels. And there is Chamberlain in the photograph, standing on Devil's Den by the rocks, saying this reunion was a, quote, transcendent experience. And we do see, and I wept with Ken and the 40 million people who watched the film, at how all these old veterans could actually reassemble and have this gathering. And then right at the end, just before he has Barbara Field's face come up and say, yeah, there was still something higher at stake, we see an old black veteran and an old white veteran shaking hands. And I thought, ooh, there were black veterans there. I got to go find this out. And I started to do research on it. I went to the National Archives. I went to Gettysburg National Military Park, to their records. I have good friends there. I went to the Army War College in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. In fact, somebody tipped me off and said, I think they have a giant map there of the tent village, the tent city that was built for the reunion. 53,000 veterans, by the way, were brought to Gettysburg at government expense for this big reunion. And I called up Carlisle Barracks. This is the Army War College archives in Pennsylvania. I said, I hear you have such a map, and I'm really interested to find out about, the relationship of white and black veterans at that reunion. And the woman in the archive said, oh, yeah, there was a Negro section in the tent city. She says, I know there was. Just come on down to do some research. And I did. I don't know, 3 months later, term ended, I went down to Carlisle. She got all these maps. There was no Negro section. She said, well, I'm sure there is. The last time we had this out, I said, well, when would that have been? She said, well, I've been here about 28 years, and I remember once we had it out way back when. I said, there's no Negro section. You can't, there's no section here. Well, as it turns out, there were no blacks at the 1913 reunion. They weren't allowed. What Ken had done is he'd taken footage from the 75th anniversary reunion in 1938, and he had just edited it together. He put some black veterans at the 1913 reunion. I mean, filmmakers can do a lot of things, with their sources that you and I aren't supposed to. I looked everywhere to find a black veteran at that 1913 50th anniversary, and there were none. The only black folk at that reunion were the men passing out blankets, the men building and cleaning the latrines for the other veterans, and the men who worked the mess tent. And I have photographs in my book of those men. The 1913 Blue-Gray reunion at Gettysburg was a Jim Crow reunion, explicitly organized so. And in fact, in all the speeches made at that reunion, of all the speeches, and by the way, all the state governors were there, most of whom were still Civil War veterans. The keynote was given by the governor of Virginia, former Confederate veteran. And the refrain of his speech was this. His name was Governor William Hodges Mann of Virginia. He said, quote, "We are not here to discuss the genesis of the war, but men who have tried each other in storm and smoke of battle are here to discuss this great fight." And he underlined great fight. "We came here, I say, not to discuss what caused the war of 1861, but to talk over the events of the battle as man to man." We're not here to talk about the cause, and we're not here to talk about the consequence. The last speech of that reunion was given by none other than Woodrow Wilson, just recently elected President of the United States, just inaugurated about 2-3 months before the Gettysburg reunion, the first Southern-born President of the United States since the Civil War. His aides had just begun to resegregate 3 agencies of the federal government. He didn't want to go to Gettysburg and address a bunch of Civil War veterans. It's the last place Wilson wanted to be. He had turned down the invitations to go to this. There are many reasons presidents don't like to go to Gettysburg to give special speeches, because they always get compared to Lincoln. But he didn't want to go because he didn't want anything to do with this North-South stuff. Except one of his aides walked into him about 5 days before this reunion and said, "Mr. President, you don't get it. You have to go. They got 50-some thousand of the old dudes coming to this. It's being covered by the international press. The London papers are covering it, Mr. President." He said, "All right." So he wrote a speech, and Wilson went to Gettysburg and gave his Gettysburg address, the last lines of which are this. And by the way, Wilson was whisked into town in a train. He spent about an hour and a half in the town. This is today what they call a flying visit or a tarmac visit. He's whisked into town by train. He's put into a convertible. He's driven out to the high water mark of the Confederacy, where they had a giant tent with bleachers that fit about 15,000 of the veterans inside this tent. Wilson walked in, flanked by the governor of Virginia and the governor of Pennsylvania, a Confederate veteran with a Confederate flag, a Union veteran with a U.S. flag. Wilson goes in, goes up to the podium, and he gave this speech which ended this way. "What have the 50 years meant?" That was his refrain. He used it about 8 times. What have the 50 years meant? What have the 50 years meant? He ended with this. "They have meant peace and union and vigor and the maturity and might of a great nation. How wholesome and healing the peace has been. We have found one another again as brothers and comrades, in arms, enemies no longer, generous friends rather, our battles long past, the quarrel forgotten. Except that we shall not forget the splendid valor, the manly devotion of the men then arrayed against one another, now grasping hands and smiling into each other's eyes. How complete the union has become, and how dear to all of us, how unquestioned, how benign and majestic, as state after state has been added to this, our great family of free men." He folded up his notes, they applauded, he got back in his convertible, and he was whisked off to a family vacation in New Hampshire. And the Crisis magazine reported 77 recorded lynchings in 1913. The Gettysburg Blue-Gray reunion, which was all about the soldiers' valor, was a Jim Crow reunion. A nation can remember too much, but it can sometimes forget too much. Okay, I've said enough. We only have about 15, 20 minutes left here, so thank you. I welcome your comments, questions, or otherwise. Yes?
To achieve justice for black people, what should his place in American memory be, according to you?
Oh, man. Well, as you may know, there's been a spate of John Brown biographies just in the last few years. There's 3 of them, 3 new ones. There may even be a 4th out now for all I know. In just the last 3 or 4 years, I reviewed David Reynolds' quite remarkable full life of John Brown for the Washington Post a couple of years ago. David Reynolds is an American literature, American studies scholar at City University in New York. Very, very good biographer. He wrote a brilliant biography of Walt Whitman. But David, in that book, appropriated Doris Lessing's notion of the so-called good terrorist. Tough language in this time we live in. And what Lessing seemed to mean by that idea, certainly what the way David Reynolds used that idea, is that sometimes there are agents of violence who serve political ends, whatever the violence, that in the end do good. I find that a hard argument to make. I find John Brown a very troubling figure, and I think that's what he should be. Personally, it's the way I teach John Brown. I don't go to my students and tell them what John Brown is or exactly how he should be remembered. I try to dig him out of the reality of his own personality and his own past. But I try to put him in the context of the history of what I would prefer not to call good terrorism or bad terrorism, but what I would simply call the history of revolutionary violence. There's been revolutionary violence throughout modern history, before modern history. When has it been justified, in your view, our view, her view, his view, for people to resort to violence? Now, some of us in this room, or in any room, any academic setting in the United States or non-academic setting in the United States, might take the position that no act of violence is ever justified. Okay. But if we get beyond that, when has the use of violence been necessary? Important. A last resort. And when not? And John Brown is in some ways our litmus test. He doesn't go away. He's never going to go away as an example. And boy, is he going to come back next year, in 2009, because it's the 150th anniversary of the Harper's Ferry raid, which we're going to have the same year as the Lincoln Bicentennial, and then comes the Civil War sesquicentennial, right? We're going to get centennialed and sesquid to death here in these coming years. And you're going to have Lincoln books, by the way. I warn you to duck. They're going to be raining down on you from all directions. My center at Yale is going to devote its annual conference in the fall of '09 to John Brown's legacy. I mean, I'm going to bring people in and really kind of have this out. I'll tell you one other quick story. We have an actor who lives right outside of New Haven. His name is Norman Marshall. And he is a member, along with a few handfuls of other folks, most of whom live in New York City or upstate New York, who belong to what's called the John Brown Society. Let me tell you about the John Brown Society. These are believers. They really do believe John Brown was an agent of epochal change in American history and is the greatest American hero. They hold an annual lecture up at North Elba, in the town right next to where John Brown is buried. They do a pilgrimage every year. I gave that lecture one year. It was a fascinating experience to go to the gravesite with the John Brown Society. But Norman Marshall, who's this actor, a very talented actor who, if he walked in this room, you'd think John Brown the moment he walked. He's got that white hair that stands up. He just wears his body like John Brown. And Norman does a one-man play, which is a kind of assertion of the significance, one, of the American radical tradition, and two, of the necessity of revolutionary violence. It's a tough thing, and I have not yet sponsored it at my center for various reasons. I am going to give Norman, the stage in '09 when it comes, because he's finally beaten me down. I'm going to say yes. Maybe I'm not answering your question, but I'll tell you what. My favorite expression of who John Brown was and what his legacy really is Du Bois's. I wish I had the actual language with me. Du Bois made a speech at Harper's Ferry in 1932 commemorating John Brown. It was not the event at Harper's Ferry that founded the Niagara movement. That was way back in 1906, 7, when all the founders of the Niagara movement took off their shoes and walked barefoot through the dewy grass at Harper's Ferry in honor of John Brown as their principal founder. But it's a speech that Du Bois gives in 1932 at Storer College, the old black college in Harper's Ferry. And Du Bois's essential argument in that speech is John Brown was a murderer. John Brown killed for freedom. Deal with it. John Brown had to be hung, just like, this was Du Bois, Jesus had to be crucified. And that Brown should be seen essentially through, in Du Bois, what Du Bois is really working with there is the kind of black Christian tradition in which John Brown became a Christ on the cross. And I'll only add to that, the one time I ever met Jacob Lawrence, the great African-American painter who painted the famous series, the Migration series, the Toussaint series, the Frederick Douglass series, the Harriet Tubman series, and the John Brown series. We once had Lawrence to Amherst College for an honorary degree one spring. This has got to be 10 years ago now at least. And the college museum managed to get Jacob Lawrence's full 22 panels John Brown series for the museum. It's a magnificent set of paintings. They're just stunning as art. And they asked me to give a gallery talk about the Lawrence series on John Brown. And I said, I don't know anything about art. And they said, doesn't matter, just you're doing it. So I went in the day before all by myself in this little gallery with these 22 paintings of John Brown's life. And you know, they're quite modernist. But at least 20 of the 22, and you could read all 22 this way, but at least 20 of the 22, there is some image of a crucifix. Sometimes it's twisted rifle, sometimes it's cross on the wall. One of them is John Brown hanging on the gallows with the blood flowing on the ground. It's just overwhelming. Every painting has a crucifix. So I gave my talk, such as it was. What they didn't tell me is they had invited a 5th grade school group from such and such a school. I thought I was speaking to my colleagues and some smart Amherst students. In walks 40 kids off a bus from a 5th grade. And I'm trying to deal with these images of death and blood and crucifixion and revolutionary violence. And it was the same morning, back when this would have been news, that a bus had been blown up in Jerusalem that killed 40 people by terrorists. And there I was trying to deal with John Brown. Well, later in that week, Jacob Lawrence comes to campus, honorary degree. I get to have dinner with him. And it was one of those moments I couldn't resist. Mr. Lawrence, sir, I just love your series. Gosh, why do you have so many crucifixes in the paintings? And he answered exactly as an artist should. He said, tell me about your wildlife around Amherst here. That was his way of saying, don't ask me stupid questions like that. I mean, why do you know, don't ask me that. So I think you have to see John Brown through a much deeper, older set of traditions than just our own current ways of thinking about terrorism. Yes, sir.
You've described a country that could reasonably be described as polarized, and you've described a reconciliation.
Yes.
And it was unsatisfactory in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Some people say, though others don't want to say, that our country is polarized now, and there are certainly people working toward reconciliation.
Yeah.
And some of us are worried that it could be in some ways the same kind of reconciliation. Do you give thought to that kind of parallel?
All the time. I see it all over the place. There's a new book out by one of the pundits. He's a CNN pundit or one of the pundits. It's called The New Civil War. You know, that's a publisher's title. It's probably not his title. And it's all about our red and blue political polarization. You know, I don't know when you could actually reasonably predict a, quote, reconciliation out of our current political polarization. I don't see any end. This is just an opinion for what that's worth, which is nothing. I don't see any answers in third-party movements. Michael Bloomberg may want to be president of the United States, and he may damn well be able to buy it. He's got $1 billion check in his pocket right now. He could have an advertisement on every television we look at by tomorrow. But one of the things history is useful for, in fact, one of its greatest uses, is to give us a sense of perspective and judgment. We have been, this is exactly where your question comes from, I assume. We have had terrible conflicts in our past. I don't think we're in the midst of a new civil war. We're in a certain rhetorical, uncivil discourse, if you want. We've had a deep political polarization over certain big fundamentals, like the New Deal, and how much of it will survive or not survive. The current conservative movement has built itself on a political discourse aimed at destroying most of the legacies of the New Deal. Grover Norquist and his anti-taxation outfit is out to basically destroy anything that's left of the New Deal. If you don't believe that or understand that, go look at what they write. At the same time, that New Deal coalition is gone. It isn't there anymore. Unions have declined precipitously over the last 3 decades. The only way to look ahead about our current polarization, it seems to me, is to try to ask what new coalitions may emerge that either find us a way through this or a way to have the polarization and have it out. Have the debate. I happen to be one of those people who thinks sometimes polarization is a good thing. I mean, if I've learned nothing else from, I spent my whole lifetime studying American history. I have to believe it's been for some purpose. I mean, if I've learned nothing else, I've certainly learned that sometimes partisanship has educated the public. Whenever I hear from my students that, you know, they're kind of tired of American politics, and I don't blame them. I mean, sometimes our political discourse is disgusting. We just saw that the other night, I think, in that tit-for-tat between Hillary and Barack Obama. That got nasty and ugly, and I found myself cringing, you know, saying to myself, don't do it. And then I realized quickly why they're doing it. But I always tell my students, if you really want a fundamental political realignment in America, you've only had it twice. So on the one hand, you can ask for a civil war or a Great Depression. Which would you like? The Republican Party was born out of the great slavery question, and it brought a fundamental political realignment. The next great fundamental political realignment in American life was forged by the Great Depression and the New Deal. We haven't really had one since. We've had attacks on that. We've had inroads into that. We've had a third-party movement based on anti-politics, as in Perot, and anti-NAFTA. He got 18% of the vote, which certainly showed us something about, you know, the political attitudes and political culture circa 1992, and he gave Bill Clinton his first election. But yeah, I guess I'm worried that our current, if it depends on what you mean by a reconciliation of our current polarization. We'd have to define what the polarization actually is. Is the polarization left and right? Is the polarization over foreign policy? Is the polarization over our response to the fear of terrorism? Is the polarization over redefinitions of federal power, executive power? Is that polarization still over race? Surely some of it is, as we're learning. Is that polarization over the legacies of the 60s? I mean, look at the conservative movement, folks. It's the most successful thing in American politics of the last 40 years. What was the conservative movement built upon? It was built upon running against many of the great changes of the 60s. And to some extent it worked. Now, as those 60s generation people begin to get old, retire, and die, and new generations have to figure out their own poles in the polarization, maybe they'll figure it out. But it all depends on how we define the polarization. Yeah, I do worry that our reconciliation may be facile, if we have a reconciliation. I'll confess, I'm supporting Obama, but sometimes I get a little worried about the way he seems to want to try to be all things to all people. And some days I listen to Barack and I say, but Barack, please stand for something. You can't quite be all things for everybody, even though at the same time I know why he's doing it. I shouldn't have confessed that, right? The lecturer is never supposed to wear his button. Yes, sir, in the back row.
Maybe you've seen an early copy of Drew Faust's new Civil War.
I read it in manuscript last winter.
She goes along with you, certainly.
Yeah.
The way she puts it is, and this isn't a direct quote, the assumption of racial hierarchy united whites in the North and the South in a century-long abandonment of the emancipation legacy.
She borrowed that from my book. Well, gladly so. I'm proud she did, yeah. Drew actually calls her book the prequel to my book, whatever that means. I'm conducting a conversation with her at the New York Historical Society in a couple weeks. She does say that, but that book, if you haven't read this yet, is brand new. It's just out, called The Republic of Suffering, is a book in which Drew, who's now president of Harvard, she finished that book just before they appointed her president of Harvard, otherwise it would never have been finished. She takes the question of death, the scale of death, the culture of death, the way Americans processed, dealt with, faced death in the Civil War deeper and more seriously than anybody ever has. And I think what she's in part after, in that, I know she is in that book, is this now century and a half tendency we have had in our culture to clean up the Civil War, to sanitize it, to make it palatable, to make it a glorious story we can all find a piece of. But in it she also finds a kind of birth of modern America in the way that we came out of that war to define death and even to define the individual. One of the real insights of that book is how the Civil War forced Americans, more than anything ever had, even though we'd been reading Emerson on individualism, although most Americans hadn't read Emerson, she shows how the scale of death in that war made people remember the individual in some ways as never before. Because he now, that individual who died, had to be named, remembered, commemorated, honored through time. There are many things about that book I really like. There's a tendency in it, though, and do read it. It's called The Republic of Suffering. That's the third plug I've done for it now, isn't it? I'll remind her of that. There is a sense in which that book at the end depoliticizes the war as well. You can read Drew Faust's book even quite closely, and in the end, you're forgetting that you could forget that it's about anything, that it was actually fought for something. What she forces you to do is to see the death, to see the suffering, and she should. I tried to do that in Race and Reunion, too. I tried to show how in American memory, well, just an example, if you had a story to tell as a Civil War veteran by the 1880s, and thousands upon thousands did, you could get it published in the form of a full memoir or in the form of a little essay, or you could especially get it published in the papers, the sketches as they were often called, published by veterans organizations, and hundreds of volumes, I'm not kidding, of veterans papers, as they were called, or sketches. These were usually these little 10, 15, 20-page sketches that veterans would write and some editor might touch up. And they would be published, 12 of them from a Rhode Island group and 20 of them from a Minnesota group. I mean, there are 12 volumes of Rhode Island veterans Civil War papers. Hundreds of these things. But they all essentially towed a line. They were not supposed to talk about causes and consequences. They were not asked to reflect on what did you fight for? What was the war about? They all basically reflect on what it was like to be at war. or particularly they reflected on, I know we're going to end now, but they especially reflected on simply the adventure of going to war. And in a sense, in the long run, it depoliticized the way the war was remembered. And in the popular press and popular magazines, if you had a tale to tell, like in Century magazine, which published Civil War papers for 3 consecutive years and doubled their subscriptions, you were told explicitly nothing about causes, nothing about consequences, only about what you did at Missionary Ridge or what it felt like at Gettysburg. Now that's not unlike today too, is it? In the tastes of readers. How many of us want to read? I mean, I don't, this depends on the audience, but how many of us really want to read reflections by soldiers who come home from Iraq saying what they really, really felt about why they were there? Of course, most of them won't do that anyway because it's drilled into them that it's their duty not to. But you can really sell stuff about what combat was like, what it was like to be in Fallujah, what it was like to be in one of those villages when the enemy could be anywhere. And we forget quickly, why are they there at all? Hate to end on that, but I think you're telling me we have to do that. Okay, thank you. Tonight I'll talk about actually a very different way or window into this story.